Jonah chapter 2. Chapter 2 of Jonah has a very short introduction that kind of sets the scene. And that is in verse 1, which says, "From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord Yahweh his God." And what it means is basically it's telling us when Jonah did this, the situation. So here is Jonah, he's going down, 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 down into the ocean. God has this fish come and swallow him. And now he's inside the fish and he prays this prayer. And this prayer is a good example of Hebrew poetry, and I will point it out as we go through it. And at the very end, it kind of has another line of narrative that tells the result of this prayer. Okay, but we'll look at that when we get there. Verse 2. He said, "In my distress I called upon the Lord Yahweh, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depth, into the very heart of the seas, and the waves swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again towards your holy temple. The engulfing waves threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the very roots of the mountain I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you brought my life up from this pit, O Lord Yahweh my God. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, O Lord Yahweh, and my prayer rose up to you, rose up to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace of what could be theirs. But I will sing a song of thanksgiving and will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will make good, for salvation comes from the Lord Yahweh." Verse 10. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Okay, so let's look at some of this poetry that I said was a good example. Hebrew poetry is designed in this way. One of the major factors of Hebrew poetry is what's called parallelism. And parallelism is when you get a verse, or maybe two or three verses, that say the same thing in different ways. For example, in verse 2, "In my distress I called upon the Lord, and he answered me." Okay, that's the first part. The second part is, "From the depths of the grave I called for your help, and you listened to my cry." Now this is actually four parallel things. First, "In my distress I call upon the Lord." The parallel to that, which means it's just another way of saying it, using synonyms, or it's either the exact same way of saying it, or sometimes it's the exact opposite way of saying it. Both would be considered parallels. "From the depths of the grave I called for your help." And then if you look, the other part of that, "and he answered me," that was the last part of the first section of that verse. And the last part of the second section, "and you listened to my cry." Now these are parallel because the idea or the concept behind this is the same. He was distressed, Jonah was distressed, so he calls upon the Lord. In the parallel, he is in the depths of the grave. That means he's inside the grave and he cries out for help. Now, what does God do? Well, he answered me is the first one. And the second one, he listened to my cry. So that is parallelism in Hebrew. Any place you see this, especially in poetry, and depending on whatever Bible you're reading, you might be able to actually see this, because very often Bibles will offset this so it looks like poetry. So it's easy for us who are not Hebrew readers to understand, yes, in Hebrew, this would be poetry. And you can see this over and over again. In verse 3, "You hurled me into the sea, into the very heart of the seas, and the current swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me." That idea, it's being paralleled. You've got the one that it's the current swirling around, and the next part, "Your waves and breakers swept over me." All of this is talking about the ocean waves and how it's affecting Jonah, okay? Really good Hebrew parallelism. Another way of knowing something's poetry is imagery. And that's another example that Hebrew poetry you can see really well here. is all this imagery of swirling oceans, of him going deep into the ocean. And what is it really saying? It's really just trying to say, I was dying, I was drowning, and I cried out to you, and you saved me. And you can see this example because in verses 2 and 3, they kind of are similar to verses 4 and 5. Okay, and that's another point of Hebrew poetry, is that sometimes it'll be like a sandwich almost, you know. You've got the bread, which would be 2 and 3, and 4 and 5, and you've got the filling right in the middle, which in this case is the really important stuff, which is at verse 4. He says, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again upon your holy temple. So, what is Jonah talking about? Well, Jonah is trying to say, basically, things were really bad. I was dying. I called out to you, and you heard me. And that's all this is. This is just a very poetic way of expressing this. And that would be 4, 5, and 6. 4, he's saying he felt banished. Obviously, he's rejected God. He's tried to run away from God. He gets thrown in the ocean, and he's now drowning. Verse 5 talks about how the waters are threatening him. He's getting surrounded again. Verse 6 talks about how he's gone down so far. He's gone down to the very root of the mountain, which means like the very bases of the mountains underneath the water. And the earth has covered him, kind of. All this it's hyperbole, which is hyperbole, which is very also an example or a way of being able to determine if something is poetry. Is hyperbole is when they just exaggerate everything. They make things far greater, much more picturesque than it is in reality. And that's what Jonah is doing. And the very end, he says, but you brought, chapter verse 6, but you brought me up from the pit, O Lord Yahweh my God. So this bring him up from the pit, the word used there is Sheol, which is kind of like the place of the dead. So he was so sure he was going to die, but he did cry out to God. And what did God do? God rescued him. How'd that happen? Well, obviously the fish. Verse 7, he continues on this. My life was ebbing away, like he's dying. And he prayed, and the prayer went to the Holy Temple. And the Holy Temple is talking about the temple in Jerusalem, because that was the only temple to Yahweh. They had some other temples in the north, but those were never really the temple. Whenever people referred to the temple, that was the one in Jerusalem. The ones up in the north, sometimes they worshiped God, sometimes they worshiped other things, but the temple in Jerusalem was God's temple. So, and that's where people prayed towards, I guess. They felt that's where God's presence was. So when he says his prayer rose up to you, to your holy temple, that's what he's talking about. Now in verse 8, he then contrasts what happened to him. Like he prays to God, God saves him, versus what happens when someone just prays to something that doesn't have any power. He says those who cling to the worthless idols, they forfeit the grace that could be theirs. Because they're paying so much attention to these idols, they lose the chance to get this gift from God, which is, God willing to listen and help them. And in 9, this is his response. So God has saved him, God has listened to him. So his response, he will sing thanksgiving. So he's going to sing to the Lord, he's going to praise the Lord for what the Lord did. And all the vows that he has made, he will fulfill. What vow? We don't know. But this is probably a vow, that he had asked God to save him. God has saved him, so now he's going to fulfill that vow. And then he finishes it off by saying, salvation comes from the Lord. And then what happens? Well, the Lord Yahweh commands the fish, and the fish vomits Jonah onto dry land. So this whole thing is really just a prayer praising God for saving him. Now realize he's still inside the fish. So yes, he's saved, but he's still stuck inside a fish. But he anticipates that this means that God is going to complete saving him. And God does. In verse 10, God releases him from this by having the fish vomit him onto dry land. And we'll stop there and continue the next chapter tomorrow.